We met through mutual friends, and he seemed like the perfect gentleman. He was very much a charmer, and my parents approved of him, which is probably a first for them at the time. So as far as I was aware, everything was going fantastic, and he was a wonderful person to be around.
Kent was 23 when he met Ian.
He baked really good chocolate cakes for my dad, and he was a perfect gentleman. Like I said, you couldn't fault him. He knew all the pros and cons of how to get into someone's heart.
Their sweet romance started to fade about 3 months in.
We were sitting down. He came home late from work. As per usual, he was really shitty. I'd cooked dinner. He didn't eat much of it, sort of threw the plate at me. This was all normal behaviour. Didn't talk to me. And then the phone rang, and I do not know who was on the phone, but his mood picked up. So I wanted to know who was on the phone. It could have been his sister or his mum or anyone. And I asked who was on the phone, and that snapped something inside of him, that the phone went throwing across the room towards me, and he sort of swore a few things, saying, "I don't have to answer to you, and who do you think you are, you piece of shit, blah, blah, blah." And I picked up the phone and I threw the handle back towards him, and I'm a hopeless shot at the best of times. And he got up and ran over towards me and tackled me off the couch and threw me on the ground, and I'd had enough, so I started to run up the stairs, and he followed me, grabbed my ankle. I was thrown down on the stairs. I got away from him and I went up towards where the bedroom was. Obviously we're in a two-story house, and he caught up with me just before I made it into the door and turned me around and held me up by my neck so my feet weren't on the floor, and was choking me, calling me every name under the sun. You know, I don't have to answer you, I don't have to do this, and you're nothing, and you're worthless, and you're whatever. And I was slapping his arms trying to get him to release the hold because I was choking, and that's when I thought, this isn't normal behaviour. This is not someone who is in a healthy state of mind, and this is not what I expect a relationship to be. That was a definite point for me of realisation.
Robert Natman is a project coordinator for the Gay Domestic Violence Unit at ACON, formerly known as the AIDS Council of New South Wales. He says the domestic violence you're hearing about in Kent's relationship is just as common in same-sex relationships as it is in straight relationships.
It's interesting that those relationships can also be abusive. It's not surprising to us, but I can imagine that it might be surprising to some other people.
But as Moo Bolch says, people in same-sex relationships are less likely to report it. She's a same-sex domestic violence caseworker, also at ACON.
There is some stigma that still exists. You know, we're still not 100% comfortable with talking about abuse in relationships.
As a gay man, or as a man, however you want to define yourself, it's not a proud thing to admit that my boyfriend bashes me, and it's a very shameful sort of thing to admit. I was embarrassed by it, I was ashamed by it, I just felt like a failure, and I don't know, I can hear my dad in my head still going, "Well, you're not much of a man."
Moo Bolch from ACON says that means victims of domestic violence in same-sex relationships are less likely to seek help.
But from case to case, it's very different. I think there are people who are in rural or isolated areas who really struggle to A, come out to people in their community, and B, therefore, if they're in an abusive relationship, to actually reach out and ask for help. I think also probably a fear of not getting the right kind of response from service providers or the police or family or friends, not believing that that their relationship might be violent or abusive.
If it gets to the dire stage where victims need to go to a refuge centre, it's particularly hard for gay men.
Gay men face some really specific difficulties, particularly in relation to accommodation and housing support. Women are able to access women's shelters. Women and children often, whether they come from a lesbian relationship, bisexual, transgender, they're often able to access accommodation support in a way that men can't, and that's still something that we're really struggling with. The problem was identified a long time ago, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, when agencies started working in this area, and still really there hasn't been a great deal of change.
For Kent, he didn't know how to talk to his family, and he didn't know what other help was out there.
I remember calling my parents after a couple of months because things weren't exactly going right, and before I could get a word in, my father was going, "I'm really proud of you, Kent, of all the men you could have met, he's wonderful, and I couldn't be happier for you, he's a lovely man." And at that point I thought, I can't tell you what's going on. I didn't want to be a disappointment to them. I didn't know help was available, and it's hard to look for something if you don't know it's out there.